Parshas Mishpatim, Meshech Chochma will start in Perek Chaf Aleph, which is the first Perek, the opening Perek of Mishpatim, and we're looking at Pasuk Vav. The Torah is describing a case of an Eved Ivri who, when it came to the 7th year, after his servitude, he refuses to go free. And we have what's called the Eved Nirtza. The Torah says that the master will bring the Eved over to the door, to the mezuzah, and then they bore a hole in his ear. And as a result, the Avado Liolam, after he becomes Nirtza, he will serve forever. So Meshech Chochma says the following: we know that this is not true. We cannot take the Torah literally. An Eved, even if he's a Nirtza, only remains an Eved until the 50th Jubilee year, until Yovel. So how do we understand this pasuk al pi pshuto? Straightforward. V'avadoli olam, he will serve him forever. That's not true. And in order to answer this question, Rabbi Simcha raises the following suffix. What happens? Oh, okay, so one more introduction. The law of Eved Ivri only applies when Yovel is applied. If there's no Yovel, there's no Eved Ivri. For example, today, we don't have an Eved Ivri. The whole institution is non-existent because we don't have Yovel. Yovel depends on Kol Yoshveh Oleh. There are certain conditions that have to be met for Yovel to go into effect. We don't have those conditions. There's no Yovel, and hence there's no Eved Ivri. What happens if the Eved was sold at the time that Yovel was active? And now Yovel is no longer active. That's called Bitlu HaYovlos. And the conditions that are required for Yovel have changed. They no longer exist. There's no Yovel. And here, Rabbi Simcha vacillates back and forth. One possibility is to say that in this case, since there's no Yovel, then he has to go free. He cannot be an Eved at that moment when there's no longer Yovel, because as we said before, Eved Ivri as an institution depends upon Yovel. So although he was sold as an Eved, he will go free immediately with the termination of Yovel. Again, it's not the 50th year, but since Yovel is no longer active, the conditions for Yovel are no longer in existence, therefore he goes free. He can only be an Eved. There's a stira between Avdus and the absence of Yovel. So that condition, that contradiction, therefore terminates his state of Avdus. The other possibility is to say, no, he was sold when the Yovel was Noeg, the sell is valid, and now there's no Yovel to be mafkia to undermine his Avdus. Yesh la'ayin, the Eved Ivri nimkar bisman Yovel, shebizman shayovel Noeg, he was sold as an Eved, ubitoch sheish, during the 6-year period of time, Batla Hayovlos. For example, there was a moment in time when Sancheriv came and he sent 10 Shvatim into Golus. At that point, Yovel would cease, would terminate to exist. It cannot be active because we don't have no Shvel Lel. So what would happen if right before the 10 Shvatim was sent into exile, Ploni was sold as an Eved? Shall we say the following? This is the first possibility. His status legally as an Eved depends upon Yovel, and now there's no Yovel. Therefore, his status as an Eved terminates. Upaka avdusa. O Dilma, or shall we say, Nishar Eved, he remains an Eved, And he compares it to the case of steachuza. Now, steachuza is a certain kind of a field that belongs to the family. It's an inheritance of the family. And if it is sold, then it goes back to its original owner with Yovel. What if it was sold when Yovel was Noeg, and now Yovel terminates? Does he have a right to get back his son? The answer is no. Yovel, when it's active, will bring the Sada back and free it to its return to its original owner. If there's no Yovel, there's nothing that gives the original owner who sold his field rights to get back his field. And therefore, the sale is valid forever. He says, in Cain, the Torah comes along with Yovel and his mafkia. It undermines and terminates his avdus. Im lo Yovel, shenis batel Yovel, nishar eved li olam kol chaye ha'adam. In other words, liolam means that as long as the master is alive, the master's rights over the eved continue to exist. Now we can answer our original question. Why does the Torah say Yavadol Olam? That's impossible. The Torah itself says that Yovel has the power to undermine and terminate the avdus. So what do you mean Yavadol Olam, forever and ever? The answer is, in this particular scenario, the Torah is telling us that he will be an Eved Liolam, meaning because there's no Yovel and he was sold at the time that there was a Yovel. And therefore, Lefi Pshuto, who Oved El Soli Olam, because there's no Yovel to be Mafkir. And I learned this with you because I think it's so typical of his methodology. He wants to show you that you can derive halachos. And if you're meticulous about reading what he calls the Pshuto Shel Mikra, you can extrapolate and derive halachic conclusions. Now, if you could please fast forward in the same chapter to Pasuk Yud Dalet. The Torah talks about a murder in Pasuk Yud Dalet. Ki yazid ish al re'eu lahargo bi'arma me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamus. And one wonders, Rameir Simcha never spells out his question, so we always have to, Sherlock Holmes, we have to figure out what was bothering him. First of all, what bothers him is the word ki yazid. A man plots deliberately. Very interesting word, ki yazid. Does it have a deeper meaning? Secondly, what does it mean when it says be arma? Be arma means with cunning. And you may already be playing a word association with the word arma, but we'll get back to that in a minute. So you may be ahead of what he's going to suggest. And that's good if you're ahead of the game. And finally, what's this mean? Mizbechi. It's almost as if the murder took place at the location of the Mizbeach, and the murderer is now, holding on to the Mizbeach. Take him away from the Mizbeach. Like, what's that all about? And it's interesting because two psukim earlier, the Torah, in a very dry cut way, says, Maka ishma meisir mos yumas. A murderer is put to death. I mean, so what's this whole complicated pasuk? And he opens up by saying, Lo muzar lo mar. I would translate that, it's not far-fetched to suggest the following. It's not strange or alien. He's already indicating that he's going to say something way out. So he's defending himself. He's saying, well, it's not so strange. Listen carefully. I want to tell you something that might not be so strange. Bekavanas hamikra. What is the Torah trying to tell us? And he says that we're going to look at the nations of the world and we're going to derive from them what motivates a person to murder someone. Don't misunderstand Rameir Simcha. There could be endless number of reasons why somebody kills someone. But he says that if you look through our Parshios in Sefer Bereshis, you'll see a recurring theme as to why a non-Jew would commit murder. What motivates that murder? What are the circumstances that brought to that murder? He says, Lama nerag etzel ha'amim. Why is a person a victim of murder amongst the nations? Chassid b'Torah, we have in both Bereshis Yud Beis and in Bereshis Chavav, two kings amongst the nations, Paro and Avimelech. Both are accused of plotting murder, and the victim is going to be Avram. And in both cases, the motive is exactly the same. And that is that Avimelech sees this beautiful woman, and they take him to the king, and he's, if she doesn't lie and say she's a sister, this is my husband, if they would know that Avram is the husband, then Pen Yargenu, then they're going to kill him. So what motivates murder is the sexual desire to have a relationship with a married woman, and let's knock off the husband. And in such a way, we'll be able to take this woman for ourselves. Now we can understand the word arma. The word arma, you may have already associated, is a word that's used to describe the Nachash HaKadmoni. Umatzinu Lashon Arma Eitan Nachash, which is in Perek Gimel of Sefer Bereshis. And Chazal tell us in Gemara in Sota that what was motivating the Nachash? We think it's all about, trying to convince man to eat from the Eitz Hadas and override and rebel the divine directive, but it's more than that. Chazal tell us that the Nachash, again, it's not the Nachash of today, it's the Nachash of then. He was full of arma, and what was his arma? He wanted to create a situation in which Adam HaRishon would die. V'hu nasan eino b'chava. He wanted to have a relationship with Chava. So he declared, this is the language of the Gemara, Erog Adam v'esas Chava. So the choice of the word in this context of arma is deliberate, as it always is in the Torah, of course, in order to indicate that this is a particular scenario of a man who has a relationship with a married woman, and he wants to culminate that relationship, and he therefore commits murder. Now, let's go back to the word yazid. Yazid ishal re'ehu. What it means is yachmod eshes re'ehu. He has a desire for the wife of his fellow man. V'yargo kidei lisa oso. And we're going to see what the word yazid means. And again, it's almost like playing a word association game, because the word yazid is a conjugated verb, the noun of which is nizid. That's a dead giveaway. The nizid is that cooked up lentil pot which Yaakov Avinu fed Esau, if you remember. Says Rabbi Simcha, and we ask the question, why is this murder related? How is it related to the location of the Mizbeach? Well, who is serving on the Mizbeach? It's the Kohen. The Kohen who's serving on the Mizbeach has an interchange, a constant encounter with those who bring karbanos. And amongst those who bring the karbanos are ladies. Why? Because after birth, when a lady is ready to purify herself and have a relationship with her husband, she first has to go to the Kohen and ask him, please bring this carbon for me. Or, for example, a zava, a woman under certain menstrual conditions, she has to go to the Kohen, and she can only purify herself for her husband if the Kohen will agree, which of course he has to agree, to bring the carbon. It's a little bit reminiscent, if you recall the Parshas Shmuel of Bnei Eli in Shiloh, where the pasuk seems to indicate, I mean, Chazal reinterpret the pasuk, but just to give you a context, that these women came to the Bnei Eli who were in charge of the Mizbeach in Shiloh, and somehow the Kohanim, in this case the Eli Chofni and Pinchas, they were able to develop some sort of relationship with these women. And they told them, hey, stay overnight, and the pasuk seems to accuse them of the worst adultery. Chazal take it in a different light, but that's not the point. The point is that within the community of Israel, where is there an occasion for a married woman to have some sort of a relationship with another man? And to the shock of the ear, Rabbi Simcha is telling us it's Dafka the Kohen who is standing at the Mizbeach. He's supposed to be the holy priest, right? And the women are coming to bring their korbanos. And some sort of there's a discussion about it, and a relationship ensues, and he has a desire, and so forth and so on. This reminds me of what he doesn't say this, but Chazal say, Al tamen bi'atzmecha ad yom moscha. You could be the Kohen Gadol himself who served for 80 years, and you can still be subject to the pituyim, to the Yetzer Hara that is more typical of a lower person and a younger person, and so forth. And now Rabbi Simcha wants to answer the following question. If a man has a desire for chas v'shalom adultery with a married woman, why does he have to knock off the husband? Can't he figure out a way of arranging some sort of suspicion, so to speak, plant a little seed of suspicion in the heart of the husband vis-a-vis his wife's loyalty, and at the end, he can engineer it from the outside that the husband will divorce his wife. Oh, no. Not in the case of a Kohen. The Kohen, no one's going to be Masader Kedushin for this Kohen to marry a woman who gets a get from his wife. She's a Grusha, and he's not allowed to marry a Grusha. So Zei Tochen Lios Bekonim Yosef Mishum Grusha Asura Leir. So if they're thinking of a way that they can deliberately organize it in such a way that they can legally have a Masader Kedushin to marry this Kohen off to his beloved Eishes Ish, then the best way is to knock off the husband. So he has no Eitzah Cheres, Eitzah Cheres, Muchrachim Rak Lahamis Balehem. Unbelievable. This is like, what do they call those things in America? Those short kind of movies, where they tell you all sorts of love stories and everything. You know what I'm talking about? What's the word? It's at the tip of my tongue. I guess you don't watch those things, Baruch Hashem. What are they called? It'll come to me. But you know what I mean? That they have all these romance stories and all this stuff, and people watch them Yom V'Layla. Some people are addicted to them. What are they called?
Soap operas.
Soap operas. Okay, thank you. I probably haven't heard that word in like 50 years. Soap operas. Reb Meir Simcha could have offered a soap opera. He's creating a whole thing of getting into the mindset of the murderer, and it's a Kohen who serves on him his back. Unbelievable. That's why he says lo muzar. He's already defending himself against those who might. Kohenim, anoshim trichos lehem. These married women are dependent upon the Kohen. The iske karbanos of, for example, a zava and a yoledes, is therefore the relationship ensues. But here's the punchline. But Meir Simcha has a Gemara in Sanhedrin, which leaves us wondering in a state of confusion. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, in Perek Ben Sora Mora, deciding what the age of a Ben Sora Mora is, and does he have to be Roy Laholid? Again, you can check this out in the biology of it, but I'm not interested right now. The Chazal assume that a child can only be molid, he can only father a child after he reaches the age of 13. A katan cannot be a father. Okay, I mean, biologically, I don't know if that's true, so you'll have to iron out the details on that. That's tzarich iyur, but that's not for us. Where in the Torah does the Torah indicate that a katan ain't no roy laholit? He doesn't have the apparatus to reproduce. He doesn't have the organs of, capable of reproduction. Guess what? The Gemara in Sanhedrin derives it from this pasuk that we're learning now, because it says ish ki yazid, ish, the chi yazid ish. The word ish, the Gemara says, is to the exclusion of a katan. And the Gemara says, what is the, how do you, so what, okay, the Torah is excluding a katan. From what? From murder? I mean, he's excluded from all averos. I mean, he's not liable. The Gemara says, ish mezid umazriya. Mazriya means he has the sperm cells. Well, what does that have to do with mezid? Says Rameir Simcha, by Yazid Yaakov Nazid, the word mezid has a double meaning. It means deliberate, and it also means to cook something up and develop it. So that's a mashal for having, for impregnating. In other words, the sperm cell goes in and blah blah blah, and then you develop a child. Now, isn't this the strangest thing? The Torah is talking about a murderer. And of all places in the Torah, to find the parsha to teach us that a katan is eno molid, the Torah gives it to us in the context of a murderer? Isn't that very bizarre? Says Rabbi Simcha, if you're following me, it's not bizarre at all. Why? Lo nigmaru klei holada, since he doesn't have his reproductive organs, is edo misave, he doesn't have the same sexual desire that an adolescent who's older than 13 would have. And therefore, lo matzui etzlo, one of the main motivations for murder, doesn't apply to a katan. He doesn't have that sexual desire that he'd want to knock off a husband in order to have a relationship with his wife. Furthermore, a katan could never be matzui etzel mizbeach to engender these relationships, because a kohen who's a katan is not royal avoda, and his avoda is psula. Is memela in the context of this motivation for murder, which the Torah indicates in 3 different words in this pasuk, the Torah excludes the katan. And why is the katan excluded? He won't have this motivation to murder because he doesn't have that developed sexual organ for reproduction. He's not royal. And if he doesn't have that developed organ, then he doesn't have the tremendous desire, and in this case, the illegal desire that might lead him to murder. Now we'll fast forward to pasuk Yudal. Actually, we're in pasuk Yudal.
I have a question.
Yeah.
But like, if the Cohen cannot marry a divorcee, but if he's a murderer, she's not going to marry him anyways. So,
say it one more time. Sorry.
The Cohen is not allowed to marry a divorced woman.
Right.
But if he becomes a murderer, she is not going to marry him either.
Well, again, I'm not writing this soap opera here, but you can imagine that if she develops this relationship with him, Maven Yov, and I don't want to go into detail, then when her husband is a victim of murder, and now she can marry I mean, she doesn't have to know that he's the murderer. She may figure it out. She has no holds barred here. She's no longer a married woman.
Sometimes the woman is in favor of the murder. Rahman al-Islam.
Right. That's true too. But thank you, Chaim, for reminding me of a soap opera. But I don't know if these soap operas have murder in them. I don't know. I don't know if they're that violent. But
I don't know. I'm not sure I'm happy I knew the answer.
That's okay. We're all friends over here. I have a very close relative who watches Korean soap operas. She tells me they're unbelievable. She was so involved in watching Korean soap operas, as many Israelis apparently are, that she wanted to learn Korean so that she doesn't have to read the subtitles. Till she found out after 2 years of taking Korean that the language is too complicated. You can have one word that has 7 different meanings, and it all depends upon different nuances of how you pronounce the same word. So Rabos, I don't think it's kedai to study Korean. I don't know. Anyway, I know you're all applying for that ulpan in Korean. Now he has a mechilta. Now, again, it's a little tricky here because there's a paragraph that, again, is on the same pasuk that starts with mechilta, but I'm talking about the second one. So see if you can find it. The word re'ehu. Why does the Torah say that he murders re'ehu, so to speak, his colleague? B'mechilta, re'ehu lahotzi acherim. Acherim means non-Jews. The victim was a Jew, and that's why the Torah emphasized re'ehu, and therefore, be'imbis b'chiti chedelamus, he's condemned as a murderer to death. Had the victim been not re'ehu but acherim, a non-Jew, then he would not be put to death. That's the first opinion in the Mechilta. The second opinion is that of Isi ben Akav. He says the following. What are you talking about? Oda Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, Hayinu musharim al shvichas damim, which means that if a Jew killed a non-Jew, he would be put to death, even according to the Jewish religion. And now you're telling me the Achar Matan Torah, now that the Torah is given, that Isa Ritzicha, which means that murder is culpable by death in the case of killing a guy, is no longer applicable? That's the language of Isi ben Yehud. So I'm going to give you the translation of these 3 words according to the commentaries before Rebbe Simcha. Like, for example, the Merkevetz HaMishnah on the Rambam. As a result of Matan Torah, the Jewish people got 613 mitzvahs. That's a tremendous jump from 7 to 613. The Torah is being machmir, and now huklu, and now the Torah is going to exonerate someone, and in the case of murder of a guy, it's no longer considered murder. The Torah, by giving us Kabbalah, the Torah is being machmir, not being mekil. So how can you tell me that the word re'ehu excludes acherim? That's how the mechilta of Isi was understood until Rebbe Simcha. Rebbe Simcha has his own take. Pirush. De be'emes gam ka'es anu musharim al ritzichas acherim. What Isi is saying is that fundamentally, the prohibition against murder includes the murder of a non-Jew. You'll ask me, but we don't put him to death. Says Isi, I have a different reason why we don't put him to death. Not because the Torah alleviated the murderer, in this case the Jew, of the prohibition against Ritzicha. No. The prohibition against Ritzicha full-fledged applies even if you kill a guy. But I have a different explanation for it. What does that mean? Bishum shehuchmeru pirush shedamo shel Yisrael chashuv b'yeinei malko shel olam Ulekach eno nera gavur aku. V'lachein hekilu ha'akum sheYisrael ha'hargon pot. Interesting. Simcha comes up with a brand new interpretation of this mechilta. He basically sees a seesaw here. There's a scale. And when a Jew kills a non-Jew, we have to put on the scale the following two possibilities. One possibility is to put the Jew to death as a murderer, and he certainly deserves to be put to death. The other possibility is to say the following, that when we compare the life in evaluating life of the non-Jew who is the victim of murder to that of the murderer, the Jew is chumrah and the guy is kula, because the Jew has 613 and the guy only has 7. So now tachas, as a result of the fact that a guy was killed, now you're going to take a hilchmaru, which means the Jew who's on a higher level in the sense that he has more mitzvahs, and now you're going to put him to death. So it means that fundamentally he should be chayiv misa, but we don't put him to death. L'chein amru b'emes amru, the language of the mechilta, patumi dinei basav adam. The Jewish court, meaning the human court, cannot put this murderer to death. But v'dino masal shamayim, he has a din misa. He should be put to death for killing a god. And up in Shamayim, they'll figure out how to beat out his punishment. It's very strange. The Gemara says that if you damage a guy, you have to pay compensation. Why? If you kill the guy, you're not put to death. And yet, if you damage his property, you're going to have to pay compensation? And the answer is, why not say it doesn't make any sense? If you kill a guy, that's much more chomer than damaging his property. And if in damaging his property you're held liable, then how much more so if you kill him? The time of the potba hargum should the kosher beni Hashem larod Yisrael the yakar mavsal chasidim Hashem came from Mamona. He says because the reason we don't put the murderer to death in the case where a Jew killed a guy is only because of the special reason that yakar beni Hashem mavsal chasidim, that God cannot tolerate, putting to death a Jew because the Jew has the 613 mitzvahs. But as we said before, fundamentally, if not for that, he would have to die, and he is guilty of murder. And therefore, for sure, in the case of Mammon, where we don't have this logic, this svara, that Yakar B'nei Hashem Amavsal Chasida, we're going to make him pay compensation. Okay. Now, I'm going to switch the order around. I'm going to skip the next piece that I want to discuss with you and hopefully come back to. But first, let's take a look at the last piece in this parsha. This parsha, Mishpatim, if you want to study the insights of the Meshech Chochma, I would give it at least a month. You could write a book on Sefer Mishpatim. And I know you gentlemen have the time for that. I don't have the time for that, so I can't study all of Mishpatim. I'm just joking. But let's take a look at the last piece in Parshas Mishpatim. That's Perek Chav Dalid Pasuk Yud Beis. And as always, it's a good idea to open up the pasuk. Chav Dalid Yud Beis. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Alei Elai Hahara, ve'yesh sham, ve'etno lecha es luchos ha'even. Okay, so Moshe Rabbeinu is going up to the mountain now to get the luchos. And I'm going to skip a few words. Asher kasavti. Well, Asher kasavti, which means that God is inscribing on the luchos. But what exactly is God inscribing on the luchos? So the answer you'll find in almost any shul in the world, except for the Amic Learning Center. Anyway, you look up on top of the Oron and you'll see the Aseret Divros. I mean, that's what's on the Luchos, is it not? Anybody have any problem with that? I know my brother-in-law's synagogue in Brooklyn. My brother-in-law is gone, but he was a rabbi in a shul in Brooklyn for many, many years, 50 years. They have an Aron Kodesh that goes up to Shamayim. And the two sides of the Aron Kodesh, when you open it, are the two sides of the Luchos. It's got all the Aseret Divros written on the Luchos. But look at the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Etnolecha es haluchos." And now I want to know what's going to be on the Luchos. Asher kasavti. It's going to be HaTorah ve'amitzvah. Torah means the teachings, and the mitzvah are the commandments. Well, we have 613 commandments. What's Asher Kasavti Lo Rosa? Did I inscribe on the Luchos 613 mitzvahs? So Rashi is bothered by this question. And Rashi says, Es Luchos ha'even v'torah v'mitzvah Asher Kasavti Lo Rosa kol sheish meos u'shloshes mitzvos. He takes this pasuk very literally. But we know that that's not so. I mean, there are only 10 divros. They are included under the Aseret Divros. For Rabbeinu Saja Pire, she quotes one of the Gaonim, he writes Azharos, it's many pages long. Some communities, even to this day, read that on Shavuos, the night of Shavuos. And he goes through each one of the 10 Aseret Divros, and he shows you which mitzvos can be subsumed under which of the 10 divros. If you're familiar with Hilchos Shabbos, this is called Avos and Toldos, or what you call, in the language of the Sefer HaChinuch, Sharshei mitzvah. In other words, there are 10 shroshim, 10 fundamental principles that underlie all 613. By the way, I took a look at the Azoros, and I couldn't make heads and tails. If anybody can figure it out, I mean, it seems like he's just arbitrarily throwing mitzvahs in. I don't know. It didn't make a bit of sense to me. But anyway, Rashi is very happy with this. The Ramban has his own approach. He disagrees. And according to the Ramban, there were only Aseret Dibros written on the Luchos. And the Ramban says that this pasuk is telling you that there's something equivalent to Torah or mitzvah that is written on the Aseret Dibros. And it would seem like up in heaven there were 613. And when Hashem saw that the people could not take this, they couldn't accept all 613, they had worshipped the Egel and so forth, so that he sort of condensed it, if you will, into the 10. So originally maybe there was tablets that were gigantic and had all 613, but after the Moshe Rabbeinu came down, they worshipped the Egel, he broke the tablets, and then the second set of tablets, which replaced the first, they were this kind of abridged form of what was originally up in Shamayim. So if this pasuk, which is written before the Chet Egel, HaTorah VaMitzvah includes all 613, which Asher Kasavti, which the Kadosh Baruch Hu had written, inscribed in the original plan. Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos, and the second round, what he got was just the 10. Again, all this has to be worked out. I'm just giving you the background of what came before Reb Meir Simcha. Asher Kasavti, which literally means I've written all of the Torah mitzvahs, lo yitochen. It can't be that the words lo Asher Kasavti go back to the words Torah mitzvahs. It's going to be a question of like syntax about where you put the commas. The Ein Rashbam. Okay, so the Rashbam also is bothered by this question. Bin Nira. So at this point, Rameir Simcha quotes a Gemara in Erev. It's quite a famous Haggadah in Erev. And basically, the Gemara in Erevin has a concept called the natural order and the animal kingdom, which reflects the will of God. And sometimes, if you want to know what God wants from you in terms of ethics and morality, take a look at the animals, because they are the purest representation. Man has deviated from the will of God. He has corrupted himself, but look at the animals. So, for example, we can learn modesty from the cat. Because when the cat has to do its excrements, it does it in a very private way. And we can learn stealing from an ant. An ant will never steal from another ant. So let's say one ant is carrying a grain. All the other ants realize that that is his grain or her grain. Don't go near it. Then the dove is considered, we say, in love like the doves. I mean, the real source for that is here in the Gemara in Erevin, because the Gemara says we can learn loyalty from the dove. And it's interesting. The dove is faithful, but in terms of intimacy, we learn from the rooster, because the rooster first, before it mates with its hen, it goes through a process called pius. Pius means to appease the hen. So that's what he says. Nitna ilmoli nitna Torah yilmeidim tznius michatul gezel minamola arayos miyona derech eretz mitarnagol. Lachein omar asher kasavti. Rabbi Simcha reinterprets the word asher kasavti. He says that God created a blueprint for the universe, for the created universe. And that was sketched and etched in some sort of a document, in a divine document. And that's called Asher Kasavti. It's the will of God expressed through the natural order of the universe. He calls it Sefer Teva Asher Kasavti. V'zeh Sefer Shal Shem Yisbarach HaYotzra. So God is the Yotzra, He's the creator, and He creates the world according to the blueprint of a Sefer, and that's Asher Kasavti. So it means that we could learn how to behave in a moral way, a civilized way, from the Sefer Asher Kasavti, meaning from the natural, the way the world works, the operation of nature. So it's really interesting, because the way Rabbi Simcha is reading the pasuk, it says et nolacha es luchas ha'even, and the Asher Kasavti at the end of the pasuk has nothing to do with the luchas ha'even. The luchas ha'even are the opening, we'll call it the Reisha, and the Asher Kasavti, which is a reference, an allusion to the Sefer Yetzirah, that God created a plan for the natural universe, is the Sefer. And in the middle, you have a Torah VaMitzvah. So the Torah VaMitzvah means that there are two ways of deriving the answer to the question, how does the divine being want me to behave? One answer is the Shtei Luchos, that's called Miliel. And then the other answer is Asher Kasavti. You can learn, if you didn't have the Shtei Luchos and you didn't have the Torah, you could derive at least human behavior from Asher Kasavti. from the Sefer HaYitzir. Now, Reb Meir Simcha at this point quotes Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is a Gemara in Brachos on Daf Heyamid Beis. And Reish Lakish says the following. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Elai alei ahara ve'yesham ve'tnolacha esluchos ha'evan v'torah mitzvah sher kasavti lo rosam. And he says, Hakavon al Shem ksav Hashem b'neshamos klal Yisrael. That on the one hand, Moshe writes a written Torah. Again, that Torah would be transmitted from one generation to the other. But on the other hand, HaKadosh Baruch Hu etches into the soul. You see where he says, Kosav Hashem b'neshamos Klal Yisrael, the soul of every neshama in Klal Yisrael. Asher kiblu chelek misinai. Each individual received his part of the Torah at Har Sinai. And he says, Hu kosav al luach libam. It is sketched on the luach of their hearts. Harusa b'makom nishmasa. Now, this is fascinating because every Jew at Har Sinai gets his chelek, which is a potential for him as an individual to develop the Torah and be machadish chidushim. And all the Torah that will ever be created and all the original chidushim were given already at Har Sinai. This is amazing. I mean, Reb Meir Simcha is basically saying that we have to read, according to Reish Lakish, we have to shed a whole new light on the pasuk. You know, what's being inscribed here is being inscribed on the luchos of the neshamos of each member of Klal Yisrael. Whole new pshat nasher kasav. So basically, according to Rabbi Simcha, once again, as we said before, we're going to split the pasuk into two. And we thought the Asher Kasavti, and apparently that's what the Rishonim understood, the Ramban and before him Rashi, is referring to the Luchos HaEvan. No, there's Luchos HaEvan, and then there's Asher Kasavti. There's the Asher Kasavti of the Gemara at Erevin, which means God wrote the Sefer Yetzirah, and his will is embedded in nature. And that's another alternative way of understanding how we have to behave. Or, alternatively, based on Reish Lakish in the Gemara Brachos, the Asher Kasavti is a reference, it's an allusion to that which God wrote and inscribed on the neshama of each one of the Jewish people at the time of Har Sinai, giving that person the potential to come up with his chidushim, and all that was given at Har Sinai. So that the Torah is now indicating two parts of the Torah. There's the part of the Torah that's transmitted through the generations. Every single generation has access to it. And then there's a part of the Torah that comes into being with each subsequent generation through the Chidushim that are a development of from the potential to actualize that which is written in the neshama of every Jew. Now he quotes another Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara says, Asher kasavti, ze neviim uksuvim. That the Asher kasavti is a reference to neviim uksuvim. Well, what does that mean? Pirish. And now he invokes the Sugya Nedarim. And the Gemara there quotes an opinion. It's actually Rav Ada. And it's based on a pasuk in Koheles, V'rov Chochma Rov Kas. Fil Molei Chatu Yisrael, Lo Niten Lahem Ella Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, the Sefer Yoshua Bilvat. In other words, all of Nevi'im and Ksuvim is a castigation of Klal Yisrael for having sinned. And the first sin of Klal Yisrael was the Chet HaEgel. Imkain, Kodem Shechatu, Lo Haya B'Yicholas Aksav, Laharos L'Shum Nivra, She'yidiyos HaMachreches HaBchira, Kak Asher Kasav. So again, had Israel not sinned, the Gemara says in Brachos, they have been given Chumash and Sefer Yoshua Bilvad. The Nevi'im and Ksuvim were written to responsive sin. It's all part of tshuva, and that's what the Nevi'im and Ksuvim are castigating and teaching, how to get onto the road of tshuva. Now, before sin, we could not appreciate the greatness of God in a sense that God knows everything. And therefore, where do we have freedom of choice? If God knows exactly what I'm going to choose, he has a knowledge of every event that occurs. So how can I have freedom of choice? So the Asher Kasavti now has the lesson in it of Bechirach, of Shit, of freedom of choice. After we were given the Nevi'im and Ksuvim as a result of our sin, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Asher Kasavti, there's something that's going to be given to you, and then there's something Asher Kasavti. Rabbi Simcha assumes that Asher Kasavti belongs to a private domain. It's similar to what we said before, that Hashem had something that was written up in Shamayim. So whatever God knows about the future, that comes under Asher Kasavti, and that's a private domain. As far as your activities are concerned, you're granted total freedom, because any yediyah, any knowledge that God has, foreknowledge, that's all Asher Kasavti. That's left into the private domain. And the greatest challenge of man to use and implement its freedom of choice is tshuva. That when they sinned, well, okay, we sinned, but God knew we were going to sin. We had no choice in the matter. And now God gives us, in the aftermath of sin, he gives us the mitzvah of tshuva. And he's saying that you can do tshuva. And God is giving us the freedom of tshuva. The Rambam, when he codifies in his Mishnah Torah the laws of tshuva, it's all after Rishus Nitna Lo Li'adam, after Bechira Chavshus. And tshuva is really the key to understand that when I made the decision and I sinned, it was my personal decision and I had free volition. It was not something that I was forced to do based on God's foreknowledge. So the mitzvah of tshuva really contains within it, in a sense, the key to unlock the mystery of Yediyah and Bechira. That's what he writes in Kain Konim Shechatu Lo Haya B'Chol Saksav Laharos L'Shum Nivra. That private ksav of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in which he predicted everything that was going to happen for all times, could not be shown and revealed to anyone, because then it would indicate that Yediyasa Muchrachas, they have a determined way of living that's already forcing them, compelling them. But Akasher Kasavti, Hashem Yisbarach B'Atzmo, like we said before, the private domain, she the also Eina Machrachas La B'Chira. Yedivrei Rambam Bilchus Tshuva Perkei she Yedias Hashem Yisbarach Eina Ki Yedias Hanivraim Shehi Atzmuso the Eino Mitzvah Sefes Olav. It's not something extraneous. That's the essence of God. His knowledge and He are one, and that is a different type of knowledge qualitatively, and therefore it doesn't force anyone. So that all is a result of Chet, and in the aftermath of Chet, God gives us Nevi'im and Ksuvim all of which are about tshuva and the key to unlock the mystery of bechirach of shit, of man's freedom. Now, I know I don't have too much time left, but at least there's one piece that I skipped, which I didn't want to skip. So I want to at least begin it, and we go back to Perek Chaf Aleph, the Perek that we started with. And if you can open up to Pasuk Lamed Gimel, and the Torah talks about bar. So again, let's open up. If we all had the same chumash, but I have a different chumash than you, we would find this in Pasuk Lamed Gimel. And the Torah says, "Ki yiftach each bar o ki yichre each bar v'lo yichaseru v'nafal shama sharo chamor bal habar yishalim kesef yoshiv l'bayla v'ameis yeh lo." So Meir Simcha says there's something in this pasuk that defies and deviates from the path and the method that repeats itself over and over again in this parsha. Here's a deviation. The pasuk, if it would have followed the path and the method of everything in this parsha, it should have said, "Ki yiftach ish bar, ki yichre ish bar, v'lo yichaseru." It should have said, "V'nafal shama shar o chamar v'meis." The word v'meis is omitted in this pasuk. If it would have said v'meis, then that leads to the next pasuk, which says v'meis yeh lo, meaning who gets ownership over the carcass of the dead animal, which is worth something on the market. But it doesn't say in the pasuk that the animal died. And then he says that it says at the end of the pasuk, it says games hameis yechtzud. They split the corpse, the dead animal, the nevela. But again, that indicates that the animal died. So why did the Torah fail to tell us that the animal died? It defies Shuto Shel Mikra. Says Rameir Simcha, and again, this requires a lot more time, but I just want to give you a taste of it. He says, "Han lo nitzkar kodem hamisa." The misa is not mentioned. Achar kach, he says, only afterwards ksiv hameis, meaning we take the dead body. Ki'ilu haya medaber mikodem, ki'ilu haya medaber mikodem mimes, as if he was discussing a case where the animal died, but it doesn't say in the pasuk the animal died. Says Rabbi Simcha, he believes that this is the reason and the basis for what the Gemara establishes at the beginning of Masechta Bava Kama, that there are two types of boros. Yesh bar shechai b'nezikim v'lo b'misa, v'hainu bar test fachim. The yesh bar shechai v'lo rak b'nezikim el b'misa, and that's a bar of yud fachim. The Gemara tells us that in fact there are two boros. If a bar is only 9 tefachim deep, then it doesn't really have the propensity of killing. And if the animal died, it was for other reasons, other causes. Unless the bar is yud tefachim, if it's 10 tefachim deep, then it has the ability to kill the animal that falls into the bar. The Dovers then nimsa l'chachamim. The Torah itself never distinguishes between 9 tefachim and 10 tefachim. It was the Chachamim who were given and granted the authority to make that distinction between 9 and 10 tefachim. And there's a bar that's royal in Ezekiel, and there's a bar royal in Misa. And the Gemara says, he's quoting the Gemara above a comment, says, Kimli l'Rabbanan Yud Avdi Misa, Tes Nezikin Avdi Misa Lo Avdi. And it's interesting. that says Rameir Simcha, this might have the answer to that question, why the Torah leaves out the word vameis. The Torah should have said, as we said before, v'chiyiftach ishbar, and nafal shamashar v'chamor vameis. The Torah leaves out the word vameis because it's teaching us that there's a bar which is not royal lemisa, and that's a bar testified. Okay, then that's just a little bit of a taste of how Rameir Simcha is coming up with diyukim in Pshuto Shel Mikra and answering them based on Torah Shebal. So I'll take this opportunity to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos Parshas Mishpatim. And if anyone wants to stay on and
Good Shabbos.
have a good Shabbos.
Shikah, good Shabbos.
Shabbos, thank you so much.